Good afternoon, everybody. We're glad that you can join us to our podcast for this episode of Belonging, Becoming Beloved. We're excited because Francis and I have been talking about this guest for a month or so, how to invite him and so forth. But we're excited to have Dr. Jonathan Tran, who is the professor of theology at Duke Divinity School, but he used to be at Baylor University. I know him because he did a seminar on diversity, equity, and inclusion with the Presbyterian Mission Agency, and he's an author. So you can look up that he wrote Asian Americans in the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, Faux Salt and Theology, and the Vietnam War and Theologies of Memory. But most of all, he has an incredible story, and it's always important for Francis and I to have people that are way smarter than us than what we think as we read, and people that are way smarter than us. And so we're thankful to have you, Jonathan, with us today, that you're taking time out of your busy schedule out there as being a Duke person. I bet you line up for the Duke basketball games like everybody else at Cameron Arena, but we're glad to have you with us today.
Being a Duke basketball fan just means the last two Marches we ended the season crying in these crushing cosmic level losses and, trying to inbound the ball in some way or other. So I'm a Blue Devil. I've been a Blue Devil fan probably 30 years. So, returning to Duke and this last year, especially, I think this next year's it. We'll win another championship, knock on wood, this next year. But beyond the basketball stuff, it's an absolute honor and privilege to be on with y'all.
Thank you.
We're glad that you can have us. Can you tell us a little about your story? Before you were a theologian, you read your bio that you're a refugee from Vietnam, and how did all that kind of shape you into where you were, even wanting to be a theologian?
Yeah, I was actually talking to one of our PhD students here the other day about this, and I think so much of what I do, and especially as a person who spends their, work as a kind of thinker, or a pro thinker, a person that gets, as I tell my wife, gets paid to talk, to profess, to think big thoughts, or in my case, want to be big thoughts. So much of the thinking I do and the things I think about and where my mind kind of goes, I think was enabled by so many years of, challenge and trying to live into the American dream and what that means as a war refugee. A lot of my friends are, came with families in search of better educations and opportunities, and they came from places like Taiwan or Hong Kong, Korea, South Asia, and India. And they often came from access, which is what allowed them to get to a place like the United States. We came on pain of death. The war had ended. It was the end of decades of war for Vietnam. It was a war, of course, with the United States, which ended decades of war for the United States, three subsequent decades for people that look like us three, right? War against Japan, war against Korea, war against Vietnam. And so, we were, if Asians have long been in the American mind perilous, we were certainly perilous because we were at war with the United States. So my family came under those conditions. We're as poor as can be and as desperate as can be. And, like a lot of war refugees, the goal isn't, a better education. It certainly isn't, financial success. It's survival. And that's not to say a lot of Vietnamese Americans haven't succeeded in huge ways and important ways and impressive ways that are admirable and give us some sense that whatever we mean by the American dream could be, or at least sometimes is, a reality. But that wasn't the case when we got here. It was trial and tribulation, and very much marked my story. So I think when I think about doing the work of Christian theology and daring to think certain kinds of things, I think it's fueled by a fearlessness that probably comes out of the reality that, if you survived all that our family had to survive, how scary can writing something be? how scary can thinking something be? We had experienced so much death and trauma that it fueled a certain relentlessness in terms of the life of the mind for me.
Wow. We often talk that my family, like my generations before me grew up in San Francisco, Chinatown. And then when I was born, my family took me to the to the suburbs where it was me, Ernie, and Bernie Chang. We're the only Asians, and so for the longest time, I just grew up in this. I didn't know my Asian identity. Like I knew we went to Chinatown to go visit family and some of those things, but I didn't know my identity. And it's only been in the last 15, 20 years when my kids asked, where do we come from? What is this about, that I've really started to dig into some of these things. And so it frustrates me because I was with Bruce Reyes Chow, and he told me he's like, you need to read this book. This book, where's my book? It is Water, Mirror, and Echo. It's about Bruce Lee, but it's the history of Bruce Lee, but it's not really the history of Bruce Lee. It's the history of him growing up in Chinatown, and I just start reading, and I'm like, and it just makes me mad. I'm like, how do I not know some of these things? Like we talk about birthright citizenship right now. I'm like, that comes directly from Chinatown and San Francisco and some of the issues that had to deal with Asians in the early 1900s. I'm like, how did I not know all these things that are connected in today's world, that are connected to Asian Americans? And I just go, I so don't know what I should know about my history. And
Yeah,
so,
and I'm not sure I know even now. I mean, I at Duke, I'm in the Divinity School, as you mentioned. I'm also on the faculty for Asian American Studies, or what we call Asian American Diaspora Studies at Duke. And I taught the core class last year, and so much of teaching, as always, but certainly in teaching the Asian American Studies class, was like learning stuff I didn't know. And also, I mean, I think I may be a little bit older than you all, but I think we're all of the generation where when we grew up in places like Southern California, Northern California, there weren't nearly as many Asians as there are now. Now you
no,
go to parts of, Southern California, Northern California, you really are in an extension of the Pacific Rim. You are in many ways, you're in Asia. But
yeah,
when we were growing up in Southern California, there were still vast places where you were the only Asian. And so, but then and we're really of the generation that kind of benefited from, sorry, we're of the generation that really benefited from, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965 that vastly changed the American landscape and the demographic reality of America. And we Asian Americans kind of came of age during the Asian American movement. We largely got the term Asian American from, our brothers and sisters in the Bay Area, Berkeley and San Fran State, when they coined the term as a kind of political term of art, as a kind of gathering and mobilizing, and to have solidarity with our Black and brown brothers and sisters, forms of imperialism around the world, third world nations. What I've found in interacting with Asian Americans, say at Duke now, they don't have that story. They are often first generation. They came far after. I mean, there's certainly kids of our generation that are at Duke now,
mm-hmm.
at Baylor, at UCLA, UC Riverside. But there's just tons of kids that have come in the last generation, and their story is so much different than mine. Many of them come from wealth, say the explosive growth of the upper middle class in China and the parachute generation. And so their story is very different. They have probably no sense of the political history of Asian Americans. And I'm not always sure that it matters to them, partly because of the way privilege and power and money and access work nowadays. I mean, America, maybe the best way of saying it is, back then it was pretty hard to be Asian American because there were no Asian Americans around.
Yeah,
Nowadays, K-pop in America is far more popular than K-pop in Korea. So
Yeah.
it's a little bit easier world, I think, or maybe it's differently easy or differently difficult in a world where K-pop Demon Hunters, is up
Yeah.
for several Academy Awards, and
yeah,
everyone, you look
Yeah.
out at the concerts and there's more white kids in the audience than anything else. So
Right.
it's a pretty different world. So that's just to say, to Reverend Chow, I think I was trying to figure it out then. I think I'm probably still trying to figure it out now.
That is a interesting observation, right? Like when you mentioned, I certainly didn't get the sense of that, even though I would consider myself first generation because I came over when I was 14. I sort of understand certain things already. And to being honest, I never face serious discrimination just because the color of my skin, right? And so oftentimes you would hear people back then say, oh yeah, the Asian, they're the model citizens, right? Like they just kind of like don't stir the pot. And that's how our culture, like our parents would teach us. Like, don't stir up the pot, even if you know it's not justice, you don't say anything. And I think part of that really harmed our next generation if I continue to perpetuate that to my child. And I would tell you the first time that I honestly personally experienced somewhat of discrimination was during the COVID time when people like, I remember I had to go to do a walkthrough with one of the tenants from my church, and I was serving as a business administrator. And the person looked at me and just like completely like Sean, and just like, why are you here? Why couldn't they send somebody else? And I just refused to do the walkthrough with me because, well, you might, just because you look the way you are, who knows, you might just bring in a lot of germs and things like that. Like, I never felt so degraded in my life. And that was like my first time. And honestly, I look back to that experience. I was kind of glad I had that experience because oftentimes I hear people saying, oh gosh, people were calling us names. And I was like, I never really experienced that. I knew that I was different. I knew people treat me a little bit differently, but they don't like tell me in my face, right? And so I think you're right. There's different, I often tell people, every immigrant has a very unique story, and there's not two alike.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you can't really generalize everything here. And definitely like times changing, the today, I mean, I would never dream like the K-pop would be so big. Who would have known, right? And it's like Netflix, everybody, all my friends are watching K dramas. I'm like, why are you watching this? They know more than I do. So go figures.
I think part of it is also we accepted things a lot more prior to COVID. Like like I served a congregation and they're like, hey, you speak good English for an Asian. I'm like, what? I grew up in California. I say dude more than anything else. It's some of those things are like, hey, you notice that there's not very many cats around the teppanyaki restaurant, and all these different, and you just kind of accept them. And then during COVID, I think there was a transformation that really happened in my mind of like, oh, these are more overt than I just kind of shined them off to people just being not educated, but that's just who that person is. And I think during COVID, it's more of like, oh, I need to stand up for myself and for others like me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really like about the younger generations of Asians and Asian Americans in the United States now is that they're not sitting around and deferring. I mean,
Yeah.
my generation was marked by great deference. Like, we're lucky to be here. We're guests in this country.
Mhm.
And so we're going to try to, say cozy up to whiteness or, try to position ourselves and kind of wait our turn. With this generation, I find there's just much less deference. So, for example, I think I live in North Carolina, about 20 miles from Duke, and in a place called Cary and Morrisville, where there are tons of Asians, and they're almost all folks from the tech industry. Many came from South Asia. And I play basketball a lot with these kids, and there's no difference in them, whether they're first generation or third. There's not a sense that they're going to wait around for their turn. They're here to do whatever they want, and if you don't like it, tough. And so there's not the sense that no matter how much I accomplish, I'm going to defer to
Yeah.
whiteness. There's very much, if I'm awesome, I'm going to be awesome. And if you don't like it, it's similar to K-pop. I mean, I don't think BTS is sitting around waiting to see if we like them or not. They're going to dominate their shows, and if you want to jump in, you can. And if you look at the heads of many of the huge multinational corporations, the big tech firms, major mayors of major cities in the United States, they're Asian and they're not apologizing for it. So that's a very different posture than the one I saw growing up. And I think what you mentioned about the kind of out and about racism around COVID, I think changed some of our temperament about this. Yeah, the deference, while it might have served our forebears, isn't going to be the posture that we'll have as Americans. And I think that's a powerful shift.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is like, especially people in our generation. So we're like, how do we affect change? And for so long we've been the people like, okay, we're going to get along with everybody type thing. And now we're like, okay, like Francis and I see change is needed within the Presbyterian Church USA structure and some of these things. And so it's like, okay, as opposed to taking a back seat, we're like, okay, we need to take a much different posture, which is very different for a lot of the people that the PCUSA is around. Oftentimes they've seen the Asians as kind of like, okay, we're going to push back, but push back on certain issues that have to do directly with us, as opposed to let's make overt change. But how do we go about this? I think that's a hard question for us, as Francis and I are talking about. Hey, we're seeing injustices that need to be talked about. We're not saying righted, because first we need to address it. But how do we even go into this in a system that is highly Anglo? What is it, like 90% Anglo, and like 68 and above in the PCOC? How do we go about shifting and naming privilege in some of these different things that haven't really been addressed before, or at least in this context?
Yeah, I think that's huge. So kind of that shift in those questions.
Yeah. Do you have any so you mentioned things are very different right now, and I'm glad to see that. But first of all, my first question is, what do you think that made that shift? Because you mentioned there are people, of Asian culture, they're less likely to ask for permission. They're less likely to, ask for affirmation even. They're just going to go. So what do you think, like during this few, several, I don't know, decades? I mean, how did that shift happen? And what do you think was the major movement that pushed for that to happen? And so let me start with that question, because I have a follow-up question, but let's go with that. So like historically, because you study this a lot, so I was just wondering, what do you think are some of the significant events that really push us to become more of like ourselves and more assured of our own identity?
Yeah, so let me talk about maybe some shifts around Asian and Asian Americans and the migrancy in the Pacific Rim first, but then I'll say some things about the broader landscape of the United States right now, which I think, it's never precedented how often people say we live in unprecedented times, but we surely do in American history. So, but for Asian Americans, I mean, again, most of us say of my age, say 40s and 50s, maybe even in the latter half of their 30s, take their bearings from an immigration allowance that largely propelled Asian immigration starting in the 1970s. And prior to that, while Chinese exclusion ended in the 1940s, it continued to have its effects into the 1960s. So what's Hart-Celler on the largely because of the benefits drawn from the civil rights movements. Once that opened up the gates of immigration, then you saw lots of Asians, and so we came because we were allowed. We were literally allowed, right? Hart-Celler literally allowed Asian immigrants, even though prior, Asians were specifically discriminated against. Like most people don't know that prior to Chinese exclusion in the 19th century,
Mhm.
it wasn't that that was the first immigration law directed towards against a people. It was really the first immigration law. The United States didn't have
Mhm.
immigration law in the 19th century. The immigration was get as many people here as possible because we need to populate this vast landscape. So Asians largely weren't allowed into the country for almost about 100 years. And so when we finally got in, it was like we're allowed to be here. And that's the deference, the sense that we don't actually belong here or really have a right to be here. And so when the xenophobia told us, this is not your home, you don't really belong here, you're not really Americans, in some sense, we believed it, right? We saw ourselves as maybe people with the kind of perpetual visa, even though many of us were citizens after a short term of being here. And our posture towards positions of leadership, our positions of belonging in a neighborhood, were always deferential. And they're deferential in multiple ways, both certainly to white power and white supremacy and white identity, but it was also deferential, probably properly so, to African Americans who had been involved in the Black freedom struggle for some hundreds of years. And that was pretty evident. Or we were deferring to folks from Latin America, who had been struggling in one way or the other, not simply because they came to America, but because before America was America, it was their place, right? So we didn't really belong anywhere, and I think our generation's then marked by what I've been calling the deference, and thinking about Asian Americanness was marked. You really see this in Asian American studies by a pathos, a sense of loss and mourning and our woundedness. And so we spent a lot of time both deferring and lamenting.
Mhm.
Um, and that really marks our generation. Look, if you look at kind of what we write about and think about, and even what we sing about, it's a lot about not belonging and the pains
Mhm.
and woes of that.
Yeah.
I don't think the deference and the lament marks this new generation. And I don't know where I would mark it, where this new generation would come, but it certainly coincides with the politics, global politics of the Pacific Rim, largely the metropole of the West Coast in relationship to places like Hong Kong and
Mhm.
Tokyo and Beijing and stuff like this. It's just a vastly different landscape. And the kids that have come now often came from privilege, as I mentioned. That's how they
Oh,
got to
wow.
America. So
Yeah.
like the large percentage of the folks who come from India, they aren't the underclass in India. They're the class able to make the journey from, uh, Bengal to say MIT or something like that. And so
Mhm. Mhm.
their path to success is already greased by their privilege in the background. So by the time they
Mhm.
get here, they're already the best and the brightest. It's MIT courting them, right? They're not knocking on the
Mhm.
doors of America saying, "Can we come in?" They're
Right.
saying we're the best and brightest. Right? I mean, the explosive middle class of both China and India. And so these larger global politics makes it that it's a very different immigration story. I think you're exactly right that each person's story is very specific to their own family and their own journey, but it's also the case of the landscape in which they come in is markedly different. So that's just to say that I think we're going to see some different things. There's not the deference, and there's not a lot of sitting around thinking about the wounds that they've experienced, either because they haven't experienced wounds as much as maybe our generation, or they
Mhm.
have, but they're not. The lack of deference doesn't train them to sit around and think about it a lot. They're much more
Right.
interested in figuring out how to do the startup or to get into AI technology or to get into elite universities. And this is certainly not the case for all Asian immigrants at this point. There's still very much some like our generation who are gonna try to barely survive and try to make it. But
Right.
there is a pretty significant shift, at least as I'm experiencing as a university professor. The other thing I
Yeah.
want to say is it's hard to acknowledge this shift for Asians and Asian Americans, because we're living in a time of such radical change in the United States. By some accounts, this is not simply a change that will mark and lead us into a new season of the United States and American life. By some accounts, this is the end of that era, right? That the United States had a good run, a pretty amazing run. We forget that we're still pretty young as a country, but
Right.
we burned very bright politically, economically, in terms of the world stage. But there are many signs that we're already kind of on the death knell side of our own history. And if you look at our politics specifically, right, and the literal politicians that we have, and you think, well, what kind of country allows that kind of decadence? It may be
Mhm.
the kind of country that's in decay, that's in decline. And that's hard for us as Americans to hear. I would hope that as Christians, that's not as dour of a note. Because, of course,
Right.
our primary identity and the primary nation of our belonging isn't a country in the world, it's the kingdom of
Mhm.
God, which is, of course, much bigger than that.
Yeah. That's, yes, my goodness. I was also thinking, could it potentially be, you talk about this newer generation who comes to this country with certain privilege already, right? And then part of it, I think in terms of, I know a lot of Chinese new immigrants come with a lot of resources. That's
Lots.
very different. And then that perpetuated that whole capitalistic consumeristic drive of this country where like money equates power. And I wonder if that's some of that that helped this younger generation or the newer immigrant generation to feel like, well, hey, money can buy anything. And when on the receiving end too. And I think, as a culture, as a society, our community here, people do look up to people with resources as though they define it as a success. So why wouldn't you look up to the success?
Right.
Right. And so I think that might play into a little bit because I do sense it like the newer because I remember one time I was looking at something and my boy now is in USC dental school, and he's like, "Oh, mom, you have no idea. There's one guy in my class that drives a Cybertruck." And I go, "Oh, so do you look up to that?" And he's like, "That's a really cool car, mom." And I was like, okay. At that point, I was like, oh my God, I'm such a failure as a mother. Like I didn't educate better to like not equate that as like the good thing or bad thing. I don't know, right? But I just when you were talking about some of that, I wonder maybe the society see that as something to strive toward, right?
Yeah, I mean USC dental school, right? It's up there with doing USC accounting, or going to any of these elite universities. So, I mean, the students at Duke, one of these universities, they're not clamoring, they're not scratching to get into the Asian American Studies class, right? They're there for to get, what many of the students call trade school degrees,
Mhm.
computer science, finance,
Yeah.
and they're not sitting around deferring to whether they belong or should be given access, and they're certainly not lamenting. All right, they're eyeing the Cybertruck. They're eyeing the opportunities that AI is kind of blowing up
Right.
everywhere.
Right.
Um, and sometimes I feel depressed about this, right? Honestly, that they're not aware of their own history, or
Right.
that we all stand on the shoulders of giants that have made our ways, whether it is
Absolutely.
the Black freedom struggle or the Asian
Yeah.
American movement in San Francisco. But sometimes I don't want to begrudge their lack of deference. I want to kind of say, God bless you. You go. You do your thing. You lead us to another plateau, another kind of generation of what Asianness is going to look like. In fact, I sometimes feel that my generation is holding them back by kind of saying, you
Wow.
need to know the Asian American history, right? And you need to know the lament, and
Exactly.
you need to defer. And I
Oh,
almost want to say, do they have to go through what we have to go to get where they did? and they clearly have it, and there's a kind of freedom to them. Now, there's oftentimes a kind of blessed willful ignorance, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes I wonder, would I rather have the awareness and the deference and the lament, or whether I'd like to be free like your son. I mean, he's graduated from USC dental school. He's got the whole world in front of him. Do I want him sitting around thinking about all the things that are difficult about our world? I don't know. I mean, I go back and forth. I mean, certainly with my own kids about this.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I don't know. I think it's hard. As we see them actually have more the freedom, I would say maybe not so much freedom because they're competing. I mean, their competition is globally versus when we were just competing with the person next to me. So I just think it's a different world. But I found what you said really profound. Like you were like asking the question that I think all of us should ask. Like, do I really want, because there are times I still try to bring out those how do I call that? The parent guilt, right? Like I say I have no idea what I had to go through to get here. And it's almost like a hazing exercise. Like you almost like you want to haze your own kids into like, hey, there's we work really hard. That's why you have all this opportunity. So there's some of that. And I don't know.
No,
I
I
think
mean, I
one of
think you're exactly right. I mean, and they're free in some ways and they're more encumbered and in some ways more enslaved than we've ever been.
yeah.
So as y'all know, I'm writing a book with Stanley Hauerwas on politics, and I'm writing a book with Vincent Lloyd on race. And I'm happy to talk about any of those things. But one of the things, the third book I'm writing on is maybe one we can talk about given the context of y'all's leadership in the PCUSA, which is I've been thinking a lot about pastoring and specifically the role of pastoring with the next generation. I think maybe one or both of you were with the Thousand Congregations movement, which was
Yeah,
kind of,
1001. Yeah,
yeah,
university.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, which I know a little bit about. Uh, but I've been thinking a lot about the next generation, like who's going to replace us, right? And specifically, who's going to replace the pastors and who's going to fill the
Mhm.
pulpits.
Right.
To me, is one of the most significant questions. I think maybe the most significant questions. And it doesn't feel to me like many people are asking this question. So let me share the premise of the book, which is largely a call to this next generation to become pastors. But let me share a scenario that I think kind of gets at the heart of what I'm thinking about. So, as you know, I teach at Duke, and I teach both undergrads and graduate students at Duke. And so, teaching undergrads, I get access to some of the most gifted students around, right? To get into Duke at this point. I mean, I certainly could not have gotten into Duke ever, but certainly not at this moment with its 4% acceptance rate and the things that these kids have to do to get into Duke.
Right.
Um, I taught a similarly gifted and ambitious group at Baylor in the Honors College, where I was a dean for a while. And these students were also fabulously gifted and able, and their future was all ahead of them. And I was thinking the other day that in all the years I taught at Baylor, which was a good many years, and all my work with undergrads at both Baylor and Duke, and all these incredibly gifted kids, right, who have these amazingly bright futures, I could probably count on one hand, and maybe less than one hand, the number of students who said, I'm called to the pastorate
Yeah.
among those gifted kids. Now, there were certainly kids at Baylor, less so at Duke, who were, and God bless them. They were not at the top of their class and they were not the most ambitious. They didn't come with the most stellar, shining academic backgrounds, but God bless them. They felt called to the ministry. But when
Mhm.
I think about the most academically gifted, the ones that had just amazing social skills, amazing athletic backgrounds, they won all these awards. I don't know one of those kids that was ever called to the pastorate.
Mhm.
And again, it could be completely fine that this is the scenario, right? That God is always going to, if you don't have time for God and you're certain you only want to be a doctor, a computer scientist, or an electrical engineer, and you don't have time for God, then God's going to find people who are much more able and willing, like what you're talking about, free to hear that call.
Yeah.
Right.
But it can't also be the case that our most gifted are also not called to the pastorate. Because the problem for those kids at places like Duke and USC, the most excellent students say at Baylor's Honors College, is that they are being called into a world that two things I find about this. They know they're not going to be happy, right? You don't have to be a genius to know you're not going to be happy coding for 12 hours a day.
Uh-uh.
You don't have to be a moral genius to know that finance is not the most morally upstanding profession.
Mhm.
So the thing about these students is they're moving into these jobs that they both are not going to be happy in. And then secondly, and this is the tragic part, for the most part, they know they're not going to be happy. They're smart enough to know that already. But they're so gripped by a fear that they won't succeed on the
Mhm.
world's terms because that's what getting into Duke means to them. Right? That's if you
Mhm.
have a advanced degree from USC, that's what you do. And there's
Mhm.
this palpable fear, right? This is your point about not being free, that this is what they have to do, even though in their heart they know they don't want to do it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they probably know they don't want to do it because they've already seen it in their parents who are themselves model minorities and in
Right.
themselves not all that happy,
Mhm.
in the upper middle class.
Mhm.
So that's one scenario, right? The other scenario is I walk into churches, and whether it be an Asian American church or any other kind of church, and I often see the pulpit either empty or often filled with pastors who are just making it.
Mhm.
They're just making it because they don't have the backgrounds that help them enable them to succeed in these things, or they're so isolated, or the rates of suicidal ideation and hopelessness, they're isolated from other congregations, other pastors. And I'm thinking to myself, this feels like a massive disconnect between our most gifted and able young people and churches that seem utterly barren.
Mhm.
Um, and what's striking to me is that the people who go to those churches clearly love church. I'm guessing that for many of these
Yeah.
churches, church is the at least the third most important thing in their life behind their careers and their families. And in some cases, is more
Yep.
important than the other two. So they clearly love their church, but they don't love it enough to imagine their churches led by the most gifted people, including their own children. That
Mhm.
Wow.
if I'm gonna produce a kid that can get into a Duke University with its 4% acceptance rate, I mean, every kid at Duke has probably got 1550 on their SAT, right? So they raise their kids in these churches, and their kids are incredibly gifted, and they love the church. They know that the pulpit is drying up, and
Mhm.
the one thing that never occurs to them is that their kid would be the one God calls to lead their church into the next
Mhm.
generation. I mean, what an amazing scenario, right? You
Yeah.
both give yourself to the church your
Yep.
whole life, and
Yep.
yet you won't give yourself to
Mhm.
imagining being part of that church in this way. And that's the dilemma I'm thinking through, which is this kind of reality that we no longer want to give the church our best.
Mhm.
And yet we still think the church is the most important thing in our lives in many cases. And that's what I'm trying to think through is what's happening to the American church and the American pastor. Part of the story, of course, is that the church, I became Christian at a later age as an adult. And I think all of us know that the number one reason to become Christian is other Christians. And the number
Mhm.
Yeah.
one reason to leave the church is other Christians, right? So the church is in some ways put itself in this predicament. Well, not in some ways, in almost every way, it's put itself in this predicament, right? As my teacher Stanley
Yeah.
Hauerwas says, God is killing the American church, and thank God, right? I would only supplement that by saying American Christians are killing the American church, whether it's forms of Christian nationalism or racism or
Right.
abuse in the pulpit. But even with all of that, I want to believe that God hasn't given up on the church. And what I want to believe, and what this book is about, is the possibility that maybe God is raising up a new generation,
Mhm.
even in the darkest of times in American Christianity. And maybe that's really the time to become, or at least to be thinking about being a pastor, not when things are all rosy and we have these mega churches and the
Right.
promise of being a pastor is being a pastor of 2,000 people.
Right.
Maybe the true calling is when you're a super gifted kid and the calling is precisely to the world opposite of what a Duke promises, right?
Mm.
um, to shepherd God's people in the slow work that you both know much better than I, the slow work of coming alongside families and
Yeah.
communities, and kind of calling kids into this great grand promise that has always been one of the great central callings, if not the great central calling of the New Testament. The story of apostolic leadership, pastoral ministry, preaching word and sacrament, as both of you are
Mhm.
ordained to, so that's what I'm thinking about. How do we get kids there? And that's what I think one of the most pressing questions. My guess is that most of us involved in church in some serious way know this is one of the most pressing questions, but I'm guessing at some point we don't ask it because we're scared of the answer, which is we're
Mm.
scared of the answer that no one's going to hear this call, that in some sense it's not something that America is at its end, but possibly American Christianity is at its end. And some of my friends have actually argued this, right? But I want to take a gamble and say, no, I think this may be the one. This may be the moment for Christianity in America. Not when Christianity was 80% of the population and we
Yeah.
had mega
Right.
churches and we had
Right.
forms of left or right Christian nationalism because we populated the White House with Christians from the progressive left or the far right.
Mhm.
Maybe this is the genuine moment for, as Stanley Hauerwas says, for the church to be the church.
Yeah. I love it. You're right. I think as parents, sometimes we also kind of think about, well, especially for me, I'm speaking for myself, right? Like as a pastor, I know how hard it'll be. Right? I deal with 24 churches. I can't think for my child to endure that 24 sessions of elders and things of people who constantly wanted to just like, no, this is the right thing to do, or you're right.
But I
But
mean, but isn't it amazing? Because we know, right, as pastors, how hard the pastorate is, but we
yes,
also know that being wealthy Americans isn't particularly good for our souls either, right? And so
Yeah.
we know,
right,
I mean, exactly your point earlier, that the kid from Duke with the advanced degree looks free, but in some sense is the most isolated, lonely, encumbered person around
exactly.
because
Yeah.
money, as Jesus said, it's not the pressures of, what Stanley Hauerwas calls the thousand Biden ducks in the church that
Right,
are killing pastors.
right,
That stuff is difficult, but at least it's legible in scripture. The
right.
difficulty is things like money, wealth, and power. And
Hmm.
we're amazingly, as parents, pushing our kids to the very thing that we often know isn't the best thing for them.
Right.
Even though we look at them, we think, wow, my kid got into USC dental school, my kid got into Duke or whatever, in the honors college.
Mhm.
Why don't I have this other dream for them? It's the same dream I feel like God has for me, right? And that's what I'm
Mhm.
trying to puzzle through.
Yeah.
Right.
So when can we pre-order this?
Well, I'll tell you another. I'll tell you another kind of thesis of the book that the way that Christians, younger Christians now, or even say middle age, middle career Christians, get away with not hearing God's call to the pastorate is because for the last 30, 40 years, especially in American Christianity, we've really played up the priesthood of believers kind of thing, which
Yeah.
is this kind of idea that God has called us, say, as a teacher or as a social
Mhm.
worker or as a
Yeah.
therapist or as an organizer, an
Right.
entrepreneur, that God has specially ordained that ministry. And I don't want to deny that at all. The Spirit has done tremendous work, but it does create something of a supply chain issue. If everyone is called to what I call everyday pastoring, and no one is called to pastoring. In other words, if everyone feels like their ministry is to be as a ministry as a teacher or as a
Right.
social worker or
Yeah.
as a business leader, but
Mhm.
no one is called to the pastorate, that leads to a kind of supply chain issue. And you don't think it's a supply chain issue because you feel confident that God has called you to be, to start up an AI corporation firm or, to
Right.
teach local kids. And those are great, wonderful possible ministries, but no one's called to this other thing because everyone is called to this one, all these other types of everyday pastoring.
Yeah.
And one of the things I want to suggest is it's what if it's what if it's the case that the thing you're called to be as a teacher at the local elementary school or a social worker in your city, that in fact you actually are called to be a pastor because the gifts of teaching, the the gifts of triage and connecting people to services, which is what social workers do. The
Right.
works, say that the gifts of the healing ministries, whether it's therapy or being a physician or a nurse, the work of entrepreneurial leadership, which is what you would need to exercise if you're going to start up an AI firm.
Right.
Those are the gifts that were usually for many thousands of years of the church's history reserved for the pastorate, because we need pastors
Mhm.
to be great teachers and great thinkers and
Right.
organizers and
Yeah.
healing agents. And this is the zinger. What if your attempt to fulfill that in some place outside of the church
Right.
means that you are pursuing something that is set up to fail because those things can only be fulfilled in the pastoral ministry?
Mm. Well, so what you are saying, it's really not even a problem in the future. Both Sean and I, we're dealing with right now. I have 6 churches looking,
Oh my
and
gosh. Yeah.
no one is like, we are having the hardest time.
And again, Pastor, think about the scenario I talked about. You're looking,
Yeah,
and over at Duke, there's all these kids that are graduating, super talented. None of them can get jobs. Right. And so they're knocking on every door to get the AI entry
right,
level computer science
Yeah.
job. But their
right.
gifts make me think, hey, if I could connect you up with, Pastor Lynn, Reverend
Mhm.
Dr. Lynn, she might actually be able to mentor you to see how your gifts in computer science could make you a great leader in this church, right? So
Yeah.
that's the disconnect I'm talking about, is that people like
Yeah,
you have these churches you need to fill. These
yep,
people need jobs, they're super gifted, and that's the disconnect I'm wondering about, right? So you're exactly right. It's not a future problem, it's a present problem.
Yeah.
yep, yeah. And so, so I love it. How do we make this happen? Right? How do I make it happen? I would love to take those kids. Just say, I like everywhere I go, I talk to seminaries. Like, hey, if you guys want to start out some kind of internship program, we have churches ready to go, right? We're thinking outside the box. Because we have no choice. It's not that I like to sit here just think outside the box, because it's like sometimes when your brain's not working, that's not the most happy thing that I want to do on a daily basis. But we really don't have a choice. This is a very pressing issue for a lot of my colleagues, a lot of presbyteries, that we just simply don't have people. We have no pastors in the pipeline.
And
So
I mean,
it's
again, it's an amazing scenario because, organizations, and I know that every major denomination is dealing with
Mhm.
financial realities, especially,
Right.
in the COVID era. But is it an amazing scenario that churches are like coming with resources in hand and saying, we not only have the churches and the pulpits, we have money and training and resources and mentorship and a whole lifetime of a career for you that we promise will be really difficult and amazingly meaningful and fulfilling. And when I
Yeah.
say it's legible, however hard ministry is, its hardness is right there in scripture. It's the
Yeah.
story of the New Testament, right? And
Yeah.
so, or the story of scripture in general, right? And so, versus, being a lawyer, being a physician, those things come with their own difficulties, but it's hard
Right.
to figure out how they map onto the story of what God is doing in the world. Does God use doctors and lawyers? Obviously.
Right.
But God, for some reason, has decided to choose the church as the primary through line in history, where the legibility of God, whatever the Spirit is doing in the world, is there. It doesn't mean that God isn't anywhere else, but we know at least God is there. And how is it that we're raising up generations of Christians, again, talented, gifted Christians, who don't heed that call? They don't even hear it anymore.
Yeah.
All the
Mhm.
while, they're headed into jobs that, as you already said, Pastor, they're not going to be free in. It's going to look like freedom. The
Yeah.
world is going to promise it as freedom, but all their lives we've told them isn't freedom. And that's the
Right.
disconnect I think we need to work through.
Well, I can't wait for that. So when is that book going to be out?
It's part of a I know what I think you went to the other PTS, maybe the real PTS,
The
Pittsburgh.
real
Yeah,
PTS,
the
that's
real PTS.
real
I think you actually own the domain from what I
They
know.
do.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
we
But
do.
the other PTS, the lesser PTS, Princeton Theological Seminary, the former president, Craig Barnes, after he
Yeah.
finished his tenure as president there, he began a program called the Theologies of Pastoral Ministry because one of the things he noticed and one of the things he wanted to do after he finished his presidency was think through the pastor. And what he noticed is there's so few theological resources for pastors. I mean, there's a lot of
Oh,
practical how-tos and how to
right.
do a budget and how to do entrepreneurship leadership, but there's so little theology about
Hmm.
pastoring. And
Yeah.
so President Barnes or Craig has gotten this kind of grant from Lilly, and it's a multi-year project where we're kind of thinking through some of these problems, and each of us is writing a book. And so, and some of the other authors are amazingly well known, much better well known than me, like Will Willimon or Willie Jennings. But
Yeah.
I'm writing a book that's on calling, specifically the call to ministry. And so I'm hoping to have the draft done by 2000, next year. So I'm
Next
guessing it'll be
year.
out in about 2 years. But I
Do you have
mean,
a name? Do you have a name for it already?
I originally was going to be something like come and see, but I almost want to just call it "Why Not You," right? Like,
Oh, I love
why
that.
not you?
Yeah.
And again, I'm writing the book on race and I'm writing the book on politics, which have their own sense of urgency in these moments.
Yeah.
But I think this is the one I'm most excited about, and maybe the one I feel most urgent about, because however complicated American politics is right now, or however complicated race has been in American history, and those are
Right.
monumentally important things. I think the way to address them is through the church. That's what I've always believed, and
Right.
and you cannot have churches if you do not have pastors.
Yeah.
And it is a chicken and egg. You can't have pastors without churches, but right now
Right.
we have, as you said, a lot of empty churches who are waiting
Yeah.
for these folks.
Yeah. And it's what I love, what you said the most was this: why don't we give God our best? I'm going to have to really think through that a lot, right? And I'm not trying to justify, but I literally had that same conversation with my boy because I have said, "Hey, would you like to?" And we talked about this a lot. And I also don't understand the mindset of our younger generation sometimes, because the other day he's doing a lot of midterm work, and I was talking with Sean. I'm actually in his housing, trying to help him move because he's doing a midterm. But the other we had a conversation. He's like, "Mama, this is like so like, why am I signing up to this?" I go, "Well, you know what? You don't have to do this, right? You have a lot of choices out there." But then he, in himself, he was just like, "Well, but I worked so hard to get here. And if I don't finish, then I'm such a failure, right?" Like, and so it's like, how do you continue to have that kind of healthy conversation with the younger generation? Because he's at that age that I can't really. I used to be able to, like, I gotta do this, and he would do it.
Yeah, and I mean, again, isn't it amazing? Like, I didn't go to an elite university. I went to the UC Rejects, UCR, Go
Oh,
Highlanders.
come on,
Um,
come on.
but back at least I imagine if you went to a place back in the day like USC or Duke or Harvard, that what you would do when you got there is you're like, the world is my oyster. I can do
Yeah.
anything from this platform. And I think probably 30 years ago, I mean, and the
Yeah,
pretension that you could save the world was both a good and a bad pretension, but at least people
right,
had that pretension. But
right.
now it's like almost the opposite. I got here and now I have to make good on it. And the greatest thing I feel is the fear that I won't, that I'll disappoint
Yeah,
everyone, including myself. And so
yeah,
the image I've gotten is that when you get into these elite universities, it's no longer I'm going to save the world. The image is now something like I have a winning lottery ticket, but I can't cash it for 4 years. And in 4 years, I got to make sure I don't lose it. No one doesn't steal it, right? The economy around it doesn't tank. And the
yeah,
fear you must live with this lottery ticket in your pocket, right?
Yeah.
But I do want to say maybe one advantage and maybe this is the place I'm placing my hope that even though these kids aren't called to it yet, is again that second thing I described earlier. Is that on the one hand they have this fear, but on the other hand they know that the thing that they feel that they can't not do, go into finance, go into
Mhm.
electrical engineering, whatever, they know that's probably a dead end too. And I think that might be our place. Because
Mhm.
that skepticism about all the things our generation promised them at least
Yeah.
avails them to God. In other words, there was a problem with the pretentiousness of our generation. We actually believed that the world was going to give what it promised. These
Mhm.
kids don't. I mean, these are kids who were raised in COVID. They're raised in disastrous
Right.
political realities. It's the first generation in American history where their economic prospects are pretty dim,
Yeah.
right? My daughter just graduated from the University of Texas, one of the best public schools in the world.
Yeah.
Most of our colleagues, that graduate there, they don't have jobs.
Mhm.
That may be our opening. Right.
Mm.
And so your question, how do we change and fire that imagination? I mean, that's what the work I'm involved in. I'm sure you both are involved in. I think that's part of the work of this podcast, right? How do we
Yeah.
fire the imagination the way the Spirit
Yeah.
has always tried to fire the imagination?
Yeah.
On that great passage in the beginning of the book of Acts, in the final days, your daughters will see vision, and your
Mhm.
children
Yeah.
your young
Yeah.
people will dream dreams. I mean,
Right.
that's where it's at.
Wow. That is
Jeez.
just so powerful.
We could spend hours talking to you.
Honestly. So you know what? I actually feel bad. Sean had prepared a lot of questions that
Oh,
he
you're
wanted to
good.
ask, and I kind of hijacked it.
You're
So
fine.
we might need to ask you to come back and so Sean can go at it. But I am just like, yeah, thank you so much. This conversation is just so rich. Like I'm gonna have to go back and listen to it a few times because there's just a lot of things.
She's gonna
And
sit down with her son tonight and
yeah,
rethink. You
I'm
don't need to
gonna,
go to dental school.
yeah,
Talk to my son too. So
I would just be, we're going to PTS and let's see how that works. Like,
that's right.
honestly, there was a point in time I would say something, he would just say, yes, mom, not that anymore.
Hey, tell him to come to Duke. He can come to Cameron for basketball games and
There you go.
learn about God's call to him to ministry. So
Well,
I have
Jonathan, we
I have
have
such
one
great
question.
respect for you on what you're doing. I'm always happy to come back on the show to talk about
Awesome.
Oh
all the
my
other things you
God.
really wanted me to talk about.
Thank you,
We
thank you,
have
thank
one
you.
question that we always ask our guests.
Sure.
Okay. When it's been a bad day, or even if it's a good day, what is that comfort meal for you?
Oh,
And if it's not your house, and where is it? Especially if now you're a Riverside, Southern California guy, we're always up for recommendations for where we need to go eat.
Do you still have family here in
oh
Riverside?
yeah. Both of our moms live in
Oh, so you do come back
Irvine,
this
Orange.
way.
Yeah.
Oh, you come.
Los Gilbertos, which is an amazing Mexican place right by UC Riverside, has the
Okay.
best taquitos. No matter how many places I've been in America, it's never been replaced. The taquitos at Los Gilbertos on University Avenue. But
Cool.
I mean, Southern California has such amazing food, especially like the Asian food scene. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
unparalleled in the world, I think. So,
Well, next time you come this way, please give me a call. I will make sure you have
She'll buy your taquitos for you.
whatever, whatever. I'll send it to wherever. So
well,
that
give my love to the Inland Empire. It was incredibly formative years, my life there.
oh wow, yeah, it's Inland Empire.
You still got you got to contend with the 91 and the traffic and the smog.
Oh my goodness. It's traffic is just crazy. But thank you. Thank you
Thank you so
much.
much for spending time with us.
Well, thank
Yeah.
you for having me on and blessings in all your good work.
Thank you.
Hey.
Thank you.